Now before this video begins, you can see I've got all three of the books behind me, so place your bets now on which one you think is most likely to fall over if any of them do. Woof woof! Hey guys, it's me Marcus, aka the Maddogg, and we're back with another review. So at the end of my Postal video I did say that I wanted to try and do a second series to celebrate Halloween. Obviously we're pretty much midway through November now, but as the Joker once said, I'm a man of my word, so here I am with my review of the Nailbiter series. This was the second most voted for review when I did a poll on my Instagram, and it's probably the horror series that I hear the most buzz about that isn't Lock and Key. The initial 30 issues that came out were published by Image Comics and they ran from May 2014 to March 2017. It was published into 6 trade paperbacks and 3 oversized hardcovers, and it's since spawned a sequel series in Nailbiter Returns, which started earlier this year. But before I even jumped into this series, I heard very polarising reviews. Some people were saying that this is the best horror comic that's ever existed, and some people said that it was a complete letdown and the pace just couldn't keep up with what it was promising. If I've already brought the book and I'm planning on reading it, I never really try to let the views of anybody else really sway what I'm going to think before I even read the book. So I thought it was about time that I sit with it, blast through all the issues, and I'm here today to talk to you about the plot, the art. I'm going to give you a spoiler-free review before we jump into the spoiler section, and then of course as always we're getting into the final verdict. But before we can get into any of that, we need to do the too long didn't watch. So this is my TLDW, and it's a section of the review that's for people who maybe don't have time to watch the full video. But I thought that Nailbiter started out as a great horror comic that then eventually evolved into more of a mystery, that was more focused on the setting and the history of that setting than the interesting characters that they'd introduced earlier on. Depending on what you're expecting from this book determines what exactly you will get out from it. And if you're somebody who's wanting a straight up horror experience, you're probably best jumping off after the first hardcover. But if that's all the review that you needed, hopefully you've enjoyed this video. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't done so already, please click that subscribe button and click the bell notification so that you never miss a video. But if you're wanting the full thing, let's have a look at the plot. Edward Charles Warren is the 16th in a line of high-profile serial killers that have all come from the small town of Buckaroo in Oregon. Nicknamed the Nailbiter because he's got an obsession with chewing the nails of other people and those he's killed, he was somehow found innocent and let free when his trial eventually went to court. And after that, Charles Carroll, who was the FBI agent who caught Warren, ends up going missing, which prompts his former partner Nicholas Finch, who's got a dark past of his own, to go looking for him. During his arrival, he bumps into Sherry Crane, who's a woman who's got her own past that links into the Nailbiter. And as the investigation continues, they realise that they've got no other option than to team up with Warren to hopefully find this FBI agent. But will that help them solve the case, or will it take them even further away from the answers? And why is it that so many of these gruesome serial killers all came from the same one town? And how will Finch's own past catching up with him lead to him questioning his own sanity as he delves deeper into the mystery of Buckaroo, Oregon? Looking at the art, it was weird for me because I really enjoyed it throughout it, but I can't really say it's a style that I absolutely loved. It often reminded me of a similar style as John Romita Jr. when he was really good, like at the beginning of his Spider-Man run, because it had these really clean lines, a crisp look, and all the characters didn't have too much detail, but they were all distinguishable against each other. And it was like that, but it was also combined with a similar style from what we saw in Chew with Rob Gilroy, because there was this sort of cartoony pop art type of style that reminded me a lot when I was reading that other Image series. And the times when I really enjoyed the art and when it really shone through was stuff like when there was action happening, or when there was some kind of explosion happening, or just in the earlier issues with the setting that we saw. I loved the way that the rain was done in this. It made you feel cold as you were reading it, and it's not because I was reading it in November. And one thing that Nailbiter did really well in its art was telling you the story within the panel by making you look beyond what you initially seen in the foreground. And this lent in well to make sure that the series had a really good pacing throughout by doing stuff like having actual moments that were shocking by you turning the page. Like the way it was set up, and also there were scenes where characters would loom in the background, or you think you'd see something and you'd have to look a bit closer and check, or maybe you didn't notice something at first but then you went back and looked. All these things made this a great horror story at the beginning, because there were times where you didn't trust your own judgment of what you were seeing, or you didn't actually know what was going to happen when you turned the page. However, there is quite a lot of Nailbiter that takes place just through conversation, and I didn't really feel like there was enough done in the art in these moments to really make these anything memorable. I know it's quite a difficult task to make a conversation exciting, but it didn't really feel like it ever tried to expand in a similar way to what they did with the action and the horror scenes. However, it did nail a particular aspect that really felt like it needed to become a good horror story. And that of course was the violence, these grotesque murders that these serial killers were doing throughout the book. It was such a visceral experience because obviously at the same time you were getting told why a certain killer had the nickname that they did. And often they say in horror it's about not seeing the thing that's scary, but in this case the fact that they did show it actually worked really well with what you were being told. So it did enough to make you imagine exactly what was happening without showing you every single little detail. So it would show you a dismembered body and it might tell you exactly exactly what they did to dismember that person, but it never actually show you them going through it, so you still had to imagine it in your own head. That's very reminiscent of horror films where you'll see somebody get killed or something like that, but it's so much more scary because of the fact that you haven't actually seen it happen. Like, gore was just done right in this book because it still had that comic book style to it, so it wasn't something that you couldn't physically look at because it was so realistic and disgusting, but it still highlighted a lot of the brutalities that these serial killers went to. And one thing that I don't really feel like I talk about enough when I talk about art is the colouring that's used. I won't name names until the spoiler sections, but those conversations that we would talk about where they could often get boring, there was one character that often kept flashing and having these visions of them doing some gruesome murders of their own. And the paneling that was used would still reflect what was actually happening in the real world, and I think that that was a great effect that they used to spice up some of those moments that, like I said, could be boring at points. There were also flashbacks and dream sequences, and the art would change up slightly, or even the colouring would change sometimes, along with just the way that the panels were used and the layout of them. So although I don't think it's going to go down as one of my favourite art examples of all time, the action and the way that it handled the general layout of the comic book medium really made this something worth looking at. So I'm going to get into the spoiler-free section of this review, and with a series that's over about 20 or so issues, it's quite difficult to do it without really giving away any spoilers. But I feel like my general sentiments are going to be similar to what I said when I was reviewing Postal. I read Nailbiter because I wanted a horror book, and for the first chunk of the story, the first hardcover in particular, I got that. But then it did evolve, and it didn't completely switch gears or do a 180, but it did mostly just become a mystery. I said it in the TLDW, but it is important that you know exactly what you want from this book before you actually go into it, because from what I've seen, there is quite polarising opinions when it does come to this book. Some people absolutely love it and they've got it in the top 10 favourite Image comics of all time, and then there's other people that say the pacing's completely off. And for me, my favourite type of horror books are when it's just normal people doing absolutely awful things. As soon as there's some kind of conspiracy or some kind of ancient mystery crap or just some kind of government experiment or anything paranormal, and I'm not saying that all of those aspects are incorporated into Nailbiter, but as soon as any of those type of things happen, it loses any chance of being scary for me. To me, there is nothing more terrifying than a relentless killer that is no different from yourself. You don't have a clue why they try and kill people, or why they take so much pleasure in it, or why they've got such determination to get this done, but it's still something that they are doing, and you've got to try and find a way to escape that. And when I did hear people talking about Nailbiter, it was often people saying, oh, what was your favourite killer in it, or who do you think the next killer's going to be? Nobody ever really spoke of it of being a great mystery. So in the spoiler-free section, that is something that I definitely think is important, that you know exactly what book you want from this and know if it's something that you can actually get. And going back to the issue of pacing, I can see what people were talking about. I completely blitzed through the first hardcover. I think I read it in about 2 sittings because I enjoyed it so much. I enjoyed near enough all of it, and I didn't understand where any of the criticism had come from. I loved the setting, I loved the characters, I loved the way the art was laid out, I loved the twists that came throughout the book, and it introduced us into this great sense of community within Buckaroo that reminded me of something like The Wicker Man or Children of the Corn, and it was just something that was like a cult-like mentality, and Finch, being this outsider, really couldn't seem to find his way into it. You didn't know what was worse, the people of Buckaroo or the serial killers from Buckaroo, because there was this kind of dichotomy between the two. And then you saw this different side to Warren, and you got other people trying to justify the kills, and it made you question a lot of what you were thinking about these characters. And in the beginning, the main character pretty much was Finch, and I loved his story and the way that he teamed up with Crane and how they went about their adventures. I was happy with the mystery of Carol and where he'd gone, and Finch try and find him, and I think that's why I really enjoyed the first part of this book so much, because any kind of mystery in Nailbiter at the beginning wasn't about the serial killers, it was about trying to find Agent Carol. It wasn't really your main priority about what exactly had caused all these serial killers to happen and had there been some kind of conspiracy behind it. They were questions that were always in the back of your head, but you felt like it was going to slowly trickle that kind of information out to you. The first part of the story, the part that I liked most, was just about Finch trying to find his friend, and the killers were just an interesting backdrop for the story. And to me, that made it even more scary that there was these killers going around, but it wasn't even the main focus of this character, that there was something else that was so important to him, rather than the fact that there's been 16 of these like despicable people and you didn't really know what exactly was causing them, or if any of them were just going to show up at some point. As soon as you put the spotlight on the killer, it diminishes any kind of fear that you can have from them. But to its credit, Nailbiter was good at evolving its story in a natural way that didn't feel like it was completely shifting gear or anything like that, even if the way in which the story developed didn't really interest me as much as the first part did. But what I did like about the story was the way that it managed to make you change your perspective of certain characters as the story went on. There'd be one issue where I love Warren, but then a few pages later I'd want him out the picture. Crane went from being the stability of the story in this town, and then I ended up fearing for her most. And Finch, well, I still don't know where I sit with him, and I can't really say too much more without actually spoiling the book. So here is your official spoiler warning, and I'm going to put timestamps down below so that you can go to the final verdict without any fear of spoilers. The main part of this spoiler section is probably going to be talking about the characters, and that's because it's the part of the book that I remember most when I think back on Nailbiter. And as well, it's probably because I didn't enjoy a large majority of this final hardcover, which is a shame because up until that point I'd really enjoyed the ride that I'd been on, and there were also parts of that last hardcover that I did actually enjoy. There was still some really intense and shocking moments, such as Crane being stabbed, everyone escaping the collapsing caves, and Warren testing if being a serial killer was in his blood. I didn't like the explanation that they'd managed to determine if people were going to be serial killers based on the genes and by testing the blood, because to me it's infinitely more terrifying to not know who exactly could become a serial killer or not. And I might have actually enjoyed this element more if it was introduced earlier on rather than just being in the final scene and it just being like the main couple of characters testing out exactly if it's them or not. I don't know, maybe Nailbiter Returns has something where it's kind of like a conspiracy theory where the government tests everybody's blood to see if anybody's going to preemptively become a serial killer or not, but judging it on the book that I've got in front of me, I don't really think it was a great element and I could have probably done without it. However, like I said, the one thing that we did get from this plot device was Warren realising that it was actually his choice all along to become a serial killer. And it seemed like we were going to get something really interesting delving into the fact that this was a compulsion of his, and that was such a unique and interesting aspect that I wish we could have just got more time with. We didn't get to explore what this meant for the character, we didn't get to see how this affected his reflection on his own choices. You just got a few lines of dialogue and then the book was pretty much ending. Because one of the themes that I enjoyed throughout this book was people trying to do anything to become a celebrity. It reminded me of something that I wrote as a short story before, and it's a really interesting discussion topic because these people actually exist in the real world, people who will do the worst thing possible just so that they can get into the limelight. And one of my favourite parts of this book was the issue that followed the lady that went to Buckaroo so that a child could be born there because she thought it was going to increase their chance of becoming a serial killer so that she could eventually sell the story. Looking at the mentality of these serial killers and the impact that it has on other people, especially those within Buckaroo, was what interested me more than this massive conspiracy of what created the serial killers in the first place. The inclusion of the serial killers was cool as well, and it was what sold me on the book initially. I know that probably makes me some kind of normie who can't understand context or how deep a book is, but you know what, I read comics for fun, and the idea of the WTF killer, the Y2K killer, the book burner and the twins really excited me, and that was what I enjoyed about this book. It was good horror fun, and I wish they would have saved some of these characters, even though a lot of them weren't actively in the story, but I just wish they would have saved them until later on in the book so you can kind of let your mind wander a little bit. But they weren't actually just serve as a gimmick, which is what I thought might have happened, and they actually tied into the story quite nicely. So you had those moments where the blonde returned and the book burner's history actually interwoven into the story as we were reading it. I wanted to see more of this. I wanted to see the clown car killer, and I wanted to see the Lucha eliminated, I think that's what his name was. And I could have actually gone for a series of short stories about the investigation into these crimes, how they appeared on the scene, and how they were eventually caught. But I said I'd mainly be talking about the characters, and Warren really fascinated me. And that's even if I did go a bit back and forth on how I felt about him. There was this sense of humanity about him, and it was as if he wanted to redeem himself and change his ways, such as that storyline when he was helping those escapees from Buckaroo. And despite the fact that he didn't word it in the best way, he seemed to become more responsible when he figured out that Alice was his daughter. But then there were other times when the dude just came across as annoying and he felt like he was just being edgy for the sake of being edgy. However, Sheriff Crane probably was my favourite character. I liked the fact that she stayed true to her beliefs and what she was working towards, but you could tell that the history that she had with Warren was affecting some of her judgment. It really built up to the reveal that Alice was going to be her daughter, and I did suspect it a little bit early on, especially with Alice being in a foster home, and there were some allusions to the fact that Sheriff Crane had actually had a child before, and they foreshadowed it well so that it didn't feel completely unpredictable, but it didn't just feel like a cheap twist. And that reveal came at the right time because I felt like it gave different characters extra motivation and also complicated the story for them in what they were trying to accomplish. And then there's Finch, who for me could have been the best character in this book. He started off so strong and I was looking forward to just following him throughout this series, and he was a true onion. Each issue just peeled away a different layer and showed you a different side to this character. Sometimes that would work out pretty positively for him, but most of the time it worked out pretty bad. You had the fact that he was this interrogator and that he'd been suspended from the job and that he'd killed somebody previously. And then you also had this anger inside him, like in the way when he was torturing Warren, and you kept asking if that rage is eventually going to turn him into one of these serial killers as well. It's just a shame because he becomes a secondary character by the end and the story seems to pretty much forget about about him. His actions have very little involvement and he pretty much becomes the equivalent of Mary Jane in a Spider-Man movie. By the end, Agent Barker got more of a complete story arc than Finch did. There was a lot of potential with him, especially at the times when he was wondering if Buckaroo was turning him into the very person that he was trying to capture. But those concepts got pushed into the background so much that it feels like it wasn't really important to the overall story to begin with. And one thing that did bother me, that annoys me in a lot of stories, and I didn't actually mention it in my Kill or Be Killed video, but it annoys me when a book's trying to be meta, but they try to get away with it by pointing out the fact that they're being meta. Just because you point out the fact that you're using a cliche or you're using a plot device from something else, it doesn't excuse the fact that you're using a cliche or a plot device from something else. It was only minor in Nailbiter, but it's something that just annoys me in general, and I hate when books do it. So at the beginning, when they were using Warren for help, it was very Silence of the Lambs, so of course they pointed out the fact that it was very similar to Silence of the Lambs so that you can't be annoyed at the fact that they've stolen from that movie. I was fine with it being reminiscent of Silence of the Lambs until they pointed that out. It's the equivalent of if you ask your friend if you've seen what's happened to your car and all of a sudden they just go, I didn't slash your tyres. At the end as well with Morty, the whole setup was very textbook Scooby-Doo, but they mentioned the fact that it was like Scooby-Doo, so that kind of negates it and nobody can have any criticism towards it. You don't see me highlighting the fact that I'm pretty much a Discount Eye fanboy, but it's impossible to do a review of this book without mentioning the fact that Brian Michael Bendis appeared in one of the early issues. As soon as I saw the character, I was like, that guy looks exactly like Brian Michael Bendis. I know we're not supposed to like him now because of what he did at DC Comics, but for me, this was the guy that pretty much got me into comics, so it's just cool seeing him cross into another medium. I'm sure it was at his request. I like the story that he was involved in, and also he didn't overstay his welcome. I'm going to round out this spoiler section by talking about the ending, and I mean the very ending scene, because it really caught me off guard. Before that scene, I didn't really know what Nailbiter Returns was going to be. I hadn't looked into it because I didn't want to know if there was going to be any spoilers for the main series, but this final scene's got me questioning it, and it does really make me want to read that sequel series, because I'm wondering, is this just like a dream sequence that Crane had? Because it also seemed like there was a 2-page break and then it flashed back to it, so is this like a recurring nightmare that she's having? And that saves them from actually having to kill off either Warren or Crane, and it makes sense considering that she shot Warren about 3 or 4 times. Or are we to believe that Warren's gone completely crazy, and maybe that's a result of that revelation that he had that he's choosing to be a serial killer? Admittedly though, I do think it was a bit of a cheap tactic to have this at the very end of the book, and it did kind of negate the arc that I felt like Warren was going through, and the fact that he realised that he must have chosen to be a serial killer, it kind of took all of that away just to make a cliffhanger for the next series. It's a shame because those cliffhanger moments such as Crane getting stabbed or Cal getting killed by Agent Barker, they really made this series for me. So it seems like the thing that I liked most about this book was also the thing that made me dislike the ending, and maybe it's something that I have to hold off proper judgment on until I've read Nailbiter Returns and seen what the actual plot that they had for that was, because it might be the case that this was a tactical move and they needed to do something that felt a bit cheap so that they could give you something better down the line. In that case, I would let it slide and I'd be cool with it, but again, I'd have to see what waits for me at Nailbiter Returns. We're now at my final verdict, and there's a lot to love about Nailbiter, especially at the very beginning of this book because it gave you everything that you wanted. So you were sort of going on these individual cases, you were following these leads and you didn't know if they were going to go somewhere or if they were going to be dead ends. And even though each issue felt a little bit separate from one another, it still had this overarching story in the background, you were following the same characters, and you had this backdrop of all these serial killers that you were learning one by one. That bit was a really fun and interesting read, and it reminded me of some of the earlier seasons of the X-Files. However, for me personally, when Nailbiter decided that he wanted to focus more on the grand scheme of things, all the conspiracy theories that were going on behind these serial killers, it loses that tension and that sense of fear that had been built from the beginning, and it becomes more of just a mystery. I've said it before and I'll say it again, what you get from this book depends on what you want when you look for a horror story, and there's no right or wrong answer with that. There's people that might tell you that your opinion of a book is incorrect, but there's no real such thing. At the end of the day, it's you who's taking the time to read it, it's you who's spending the money on it. So if you're going into this because you like the aspect of the serial killers and you want that to become more of a vehicle for a more sinister plot that traces back through the history of a small town and deals with all these conspiracies, then Nailbiter could very easily be one of your favourite books. However, if you're like me and you like your horror stories to be focused more on the moment and keeping the tension on the serial killer that's often coming for you, then unfortunately by the 3rd hardcover this book may actually fall short of your expectations. However, because of the way that the story was structured and the way that the art tells the story in the background and there's a lot of little detail that the more observant reader can actually benefit from, so that even if, like myself, you're in that second category and you wanted more of a horror story, there is enough in here so that you can still enjoy this through to the end, even if it might be the case that the story might have bitten off more nail than it can actually chew. I've been working all day on that awful pun, so please just let me have that one. So Nailbiter comes with a strong recommendation, but with an asterisk for those who are wanting more of the comic book equivalent of a slasher, because you may actually get something that's more like a murder mystery. Still, it gets a modest and strong 3 out of 5 woofs. Woof, woof, woof. But that's my review of Nailbiter, and this one has taken an absolute while to script, even if I did actually fly through the books. So I'm hoping that you've enjoyed it, even if I have an opinion that doesn't directly line up with your own. It's completely fine if you disagree with me, and you might have been one of the people that absolutely hates Nailbiter, or it might be one of your top 5 comics of all time. That's completely fine, and more power to you, and I'd actually like to hear what you guys thought of Nailbiter. No matter which side of the coin that you fall, I just want to see what other people thought about this book. So leave it in the comment section below and we can discuss it there, and if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you didn't like this video, why did you get this far? Please subscribe if you haven't done so already. We're so close to 1,000 subscribers, and I am planning on doing a special live stream, and I've got a few surprises that might happen throughout there, so hopefully we can make that happen. And if you don't want to miss a video, because I've got an awful schedule and there's no kind of consistency with it, I'd just recommend clicking the bell notification next to it. As well, make sure that you follow me on my social media links and try and put up as much comic content on there as I can, and I like getting interaction from yourselves as well, so I put up polls to see what the next book you want me to read is. And if you want to support the channel, it is greatly appreciated. I'm not going to ask for a Patreon or anything like that, because I just don't think I've got enough to offer, but what I do ask is that you treat yourself to a book. Maybe you want to pick up these Nailbiter volumes, but just please use one of the Amazon affiliate links down below. I can't see any of your details, it doesn't increase the price, it just means that eventually some money's going to come into this channel. But that's the video, and I definitely need to sleep. I'm reading Aquaman by Jeff Johns at the minute, so get the booze ready for when that review comes out, but just make sure that you stay safe, keep reading, and keep barking all you mad dogs, and I'll see you at the next video.